And I must confess that there are moments when I begin to wonder whether I am adequate or whether I'm able to face all of the challenges and even the responsibilities of this particular position. I don't think anyone in a situation like this can go through it without confronting moments of real fear.
Think about who said that. Not someone who gave up, not someone who ran, someone who kept showing up every single day, even when showing up meant putting everything on the line. His family, his home, his life. And here's what makes this story so hard to understand. He wasn't born a hero. He wasn't fearless. He was a young man who chose to lead, even when he was terrified of what that choice would cost him. And the cost was higher than almost anyone could imagine paying. But before we get to that, there's a story that starts long before the marches, long before the speeches, in a city where a boy was learning what the world thought of him, simply because of the color of his skin. But this isn't just a story about someone who fought for justice. Those stories exist everywhere. This one is different, because most people who face this kind of hatred either fight back with anger or they walk away. He did neither. He chose something that most people would call impossible: to love the people who were trying to destroy him. And here's what nobody talks about when they tell his story. That choice wasn't easy. That choice wasn't natural. That choice almost broke him more than once. Because it's one thing to preach about love and courage from a pulpit. It's another thing entirely to stand on your bombed front porch, look at the people who tried to kill your family, and choose peace. That's not a sermon. That's the hardest thing a human being can do. And the question nobody asks is, how did he get there? What shaped a man capable of making that choice in that moment? That's where the real story begins. Before anyone knew his name, he was just a boy growing up on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, Georgia. His family called it Sweet Auburn, the heart of Black prosperity in the American South. His father was a pastor. His grandfather had been a pastor. His home was full of warmth, faith, and purpose. By every measure, he had a good life. But the world outside that home had different ideas about what his life was worth. He couldn't swim in public pools, couldn't eat at lunch counters, couldn't sit in the same theaters as white children his age. And then one day, when he was 6 years old, his best friend's parents told their son he could no longer play with the black boy from down the street. Just like that, no explanation that a child could understand, just a door closing. And something shifted inside the boy that day, a question that wouldn't go away. Why? He carried that question through childhood, through the grief of losing his grandmother at 12, a loss so devastating that the boy jumped from a window in a moment of despair. Through the summers in Connecticut, where he saw for the first time that black and white people could eat together, worship together, simply exist together. And the contrast burned, because back home in Atlanta, none of that was true. So he studied, harder than anyone expected. He entered college at 15, earned his doctorate at 25, not because he wanted prestige, but because he understood something most people his age didn't. That The fight ahead would require more than courage. It would require a mind sharp enough to dismantle the arguments of the people who wanted things to stay the same. So he prepared, quietly, deliberately, a young pastor with a loving wife and a baby daughter and a modest life in Montgomery, Alabama. And for a while, it looked like that quiet life might actually be possible. And then Rosa Parks sat down. December 1st, 1955, a 42-year-old seamstress refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery city bus and was arrested for it. The Black community of Montgomery had been waiting for a moment like this, a spark. And when it came, they needed someone to lead, someone young enough to have energy, educated enough to have credibility, new enough to the city to have no enemies. They chose him. He was 26 years old. He had a newborn daughter, a wife who had just started to build a life in a new city. And he said yes. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because something inside him couldn't say no. And from the moment he said yes, the threats began. Phone calls in the middle of the night. If you aren't out of this town in 3 days, we're going to blow your brains out and blow up your house. Night after night, call after call. And one night, sitting alone at his kitchen table, long after everyone else had gone to sleep, he broke. Not publicly, not dramatically, just quietly. A young man with his head in his hands at a kitchen table in the middle of the night, admitting to himself what he hadn't told anyone. He was terrified. He prayed out loud in that empty kitchen, "Lord, I'm down here trying to do what's right. But Lord, I must confess that I'm weak now. I'm faltering. I'm losing my courage." And in that silence, something happened. A stillness, a sense of presence, and a voice, whether from within or beyond, that told him to stand up, that the fight was just, that he would not be alone. He lifted his head, and he kept going. 3 weeks later, on the 57th day of the boycott, he was standing at a pulpit giving a speech when someone handed him a note. He read it once, then again. His home had been bombed. He kept his composure at the pulpit. He finished what he was saying, and then he drove home. What he found when he arrived was not the worst part. The worst part was what he didn't find. He didn't find chaos. He didn't find panic. He found a crowd. Hundreds of people gathered outside his destroyed home, armed, angry, ready. Men with knives and guns who had decided that this time they would not turn the other cheek. That this time the answer to violence would be violence. And somewhere inside that house, Coretta and their baby daughter, Yolanda, 10 weeks old, both of them alive by inches. He stood on what was left of his front porch, the smoke still rising behind him, the crowd waiting for him to say the words they wanted to hear. And instead, he raised his hand. "If you have weapons, take them home. We cannot solve this problem through violence. We must meet violence with non-violence." The crowd went quiet, and then he said something that stopped everyone. "If I am stopped, our work will not stop, for what we are doing is right. What we are doing is just, and God is with us." He wasn't performing. He wasn't giving a speech. He was a 27-year-old man standing in the ruins of the home where his wife and daughter had almost died, choosing peace when every human instinct was screaming otherwise. And in that moment, everything changed. And the young pastor standing on that bombed porch, who had almost quit at a kitchen table in the middle of the night, who had chosen peace when his family had almost been taken from him, who had looked at a crowd of angry men and asked them to love their enemies, wasn't just anyone. That man was Martin Luther King Jr. And the boycott continued. 381 days. 381 days of walking to work, of coordinating rides, of facing harassment and intimidation every single morning. 381 days of choosing to believe that it would matter. And on December 20th, 1956, the buses of Montgomery were integrated, not because the system changed on its own, not because someone in power decided to do the right thing, but because the community refused to move, led by a man who refused to quit at a kitchen table in the middle of the night. And the world started paying attention. What had begun in Montgomery was spreading. Lunch counters, courthouses, universities. Everywhere people had been told to accept less than they deserved. Something was waking up. And at the center of it all, a young pastor who had once been terrified was now standing in front of hundreds of thousands of people at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, looking out at a crowd that stretched as far as he could see and saying words that would echo for generations. I have a dream that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. 250,000 people, one voice, and 1 year later, at 35 years old, he became the youngest person in history to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. The boy who had jumped from a window in grief at 12. The young man who had broken down at a kitchen table in the middle of the night was standing in Oslo, receiving the world's highest honor for peace. And through all of it, he never forgot where the strength had come from. Not from the crowds, not from the speeches, not from the awards, from that kitchen table, from the moment he had nothing left and chose to keep going anyway. He went back to the communities that had started it all, back to the churches, back to the people who had walked to work for 381 days, back to the ordinary men and women who had made the extraordinary possible without anyone knowing their names. And he brought Coretta, the woman who had been inside that house when the bomb went off, who had never asked him to stop, who had never asked him to choose safety over purpose, who understood, perhaps better than anyone, what the work was costing and what it was worth. Together they built something that went beyond marches and speeches and headlines. They built a community of people who believed that love was not weakness, that nonviolence was not surrender, that a man standing on a bombed front porch asking for peace was not a fool. He was showing the world what courage actually looked like. There's a version of this story where he quits at that kitchen table, where the phone calls are too many, where the fear is too heavy, where the bomb is the last straw. That version almost happened, but in the silence of that kitchen, in the moment when he had nothing left, he made a choice. Not to be defined by what was done to him, but by what he chose to do in response. And so if you're sitting at your own kitchen table right now, if the fear is louder than the purpose, if the cost of standing up feels higher than you can pay, remember this: The most important moment in this entire story wasn't the March on Washington. It wasn't the Nobel Prize. It was a young man alone in a kitchen in the middle of the night, choosing not to quit. That's where movements begin, not on stages, not in history books, in the quiet moments when nobody is watching, and you decide to keep going anyway. Sometimes the place that breaks you open is exactly where the real story begins. That's the story of Martin Luther King Jr. This is Before They Knew. See you next time.